Chris Carter here from the Locked On Steelers podcast, here with you on an emergency podcast after the Steelers have lost their playoff game 31-17 to the Buffalo Bills. The Steelers dug themselves a hole fast and early with turnovers and untimely defense that allowed the Bills to surge out to a 21-point lead. They were able to fight back and make it a one-score game when they made it 17-24, I believe it was, in the early part of the fourth quarter. Lots of notes to have about this game. The continued trend of turnovers in the playoffs continues to plague the Steelers. There were two big things we talked about all week long that the Steelers had to do. They had to they had to win the turnover battle, not just not turn over the ball, but win the turnover battle. And B, they had to run the football. They lost the turnover battle, which led to them not being able to run the football, as the Bills were able to force them to kind of be one-dimensional throughout the rest of the game, and that kind of killed the Steelers' path in this. Much credit should go to Mason Rudolph. He did throw a bad interception, but that guy hung in there. 22 of 39, 229 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I think he hung in there as best as much in a game that was getting out of hand. But I can't fault him too much outside of the interception for his effort in this game. But key problems early on in this game. Once again, George Pickens' fumble, just untimely turnovers have been the killer for the Steelers in these playoff games. You look back to their last 4 playoff losses, those losses have all come with a combined, I think, 49 total points off turnovers that opponents have gotten in those games that have led to the Steelers losing those games. And that's just you can't have that in playoff football. And it happens yet again in big situations in this game. George Pickens notably frustrated at the end of the game. I did think at the end of the game, and Steelers fans are going to talk about this, that the officials played a big hand in things. I think that was there were several egregious calls that were benefiting the Bills, like the shot to Joey Porter's head that wasn't called and things like that. But at the end of the day, if you put yourself in a better position, those penalties maybe help the Bills have a chance to come back rather than it being about you trying to come back. And that's where the Steelers needed to control things today. They just did not. When you get the early fumble from George Pickens, they were very fortunate with the Pat Freiermuth fumble that it bounced off his helmet while he was out of bounds. And then Mason Rudolph's interception in the red zone. If he doesn't throw that pick, if that's a touchdown drive, you're looking at a completely different ball game. That touchdown at the end of the early part of the fourth quarter is to tie the game, not to get you within one score, and that could have changed the tenor entirely. And on the flip side, the defense needed to create turnovers, and they didn't. They did have the blocked field goal that set them up for their first touchdown of the game, and the special teams, deserves credit for that. But in all seriousness, you needed to be able to create turnovers from Josh Allen, and you needed to also have a lead to do that. You needed to force him to be desperate. I think there was maybe one desperate pass that he threw last in this game, and that was the pass that Eric Rowe almost intercepted. And it worked out that he didn't intercept it because that was right before the field goal block. But you look at that, and it was just the complete recipe for the Steelers not winning this game and not overcoming, their own misfortune in this one. They got to look at that, and they got to reassess things. I think there's a lot of stuff that has to be reassessed. One, there's a lot of talk about Mike Tomlin, his future. Does he want to come back? Personally, everything I've seen with Mike Tomlin, this guy's a football committed guy. I don't think the Steelers are getting rid of him. If he chooses to walk away, that would be his decision. I haven't seen much that would say that he would do that. Whenever you talk to that guy about football, he seems locked in about, everything football, but, hey, could be surprised there. But I think that the priority, you look at this game, the Steelers needed to control the offensive line, or the line of scrimmage more, especially on offense and on defense too. They gave up too much on the ground in this game. That's another point that happened here. James Cook averaged 4.4 yards per carry. Allen, 9.3 yards per carry. The Steelers' defensive front was not dominant. Neither was the offensive front. And those were all plays that, that did not allow the Steelers to get back into this game. And that's something that has to change if they want to play the way that they want to play moving forward. To me, that means investing properly at center. That means investing on another offensive tackle, properly helping develop Broderick Jones, because I thought he had a bad game in this one, and making sure that that's a priority in this next season. But of course, there's also big questions about the quarterback position. Mason Rudolph, I felt he didn't have a terrible game in this one. He did have a terrible play in that interception, and that certainly helped bury the Steelers. But this was a guy all throughout the second half, and even before the second half, after the interception, he stayed focused. He was locked in. He was making he was doing a good job managing the pocket, keeping his eyes downfield, and making plays here and there. Still not a guy I think who's ever going to be, a star quarterback in the NFL, but that was more than a respectable effort in a game that was getting away from the Steelers for him to try to give them a chance to come back in that. I want to talk about what you do with Mason Rudolph and what comes next for the Steelers, especially with Kenny Pickett sitting there and all the big questions. What do you do with Mason Rudolph being a free agent? We'll do that right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. More to discuss in this emergency podcast. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, Chris Carter recapping the games the Steelers lost to the Bills in the playoffs. It was, again, I'm not going to say that Mason, I'm not even sure if he was quote unquote good, but I thought he showed real guts in this game, in a game where he could have started falling in on himself once the game got to 21-0. He could have kept making more mistakes, but he didn't. He shrugged it off, and he gave some valiant effort. And there were some plays, especially like there was that one completion on third down over the middle to George Pickens. He bought time, kept his eyes downfield, delivered a strike over the middle in the middle of the defense. Pickens also making a great catch in that moment. That kind of stuff, I think that stuff will catch teams' eyes. I do think that Mason Rudolph is in a different position than he was last year when he was a free agent and the Steelers let him test free agency, and then he came back because he didn't get any offers anywhere. He even said earlier this season, he was like, "Look, my next plan was commercial real estate before this." But I think when you have 3 games with a passer rating of over 112 to end the season, and then you show the kind of guts you did in this playoff game. I'm not saying he's going to get some mega deal somewhere, but someone might give him like a $5 to $8 million contract just to be the number 2 quarterback and say like, hey, if we can get that kind of performance for a game or two, if our star guy goes down or our rookie goes down or whoever they have on their team goes down, some team might pay them that. I mean, pay them the kind of money that the Steelers paid Mitch Trubisky, which looking like not a good deal at this point. I think those are all things that could that could happen there. I mean, teams could also still not be like, we don't buy into Mason Rudolph. That could happen. But I think, but if that does happen, I think the Steelers definitely offer him some sort of deal. Let Trubisky go. And Mason Rudolph is either your starting quarterback or your backup quarterback next year. But if you can bring him back and bring him back with Kenny Pickett, that'll be an interesting conversation. And the question there also, what do you do with Kenny Pickett? Because you were 7-2 in games that he started and finished healthy. And I think that there's something to be said about his effort to stick with games, but also something to be said with the fact that he just wasn't leading enough scoring drives, and he didn't have enough scoring touchdowns. I think the lowest touchdown percentage of any quarterback in NFL history with X amount of games or whatever, X amount of snaps. You got to have more production from him. He actually has to develop, and all of that points to, if you want to develop him, or if you go draft a rookie quarterback, I don't think you should do that with your first round pick. But if some of those guys fall to the second or third round who you think could be talented enough to maybe, be a guy in your quarterback roster, I think it would be worth a look at in this offseason, in this draft process. I think we will be looking at quarterbacks when we start doing our draft talk here in this show. But either way, whether it's Mason, Kenny, and a rookie, or Kenny, Mitch, and a rookie, or Mason, Kenny, and another vet that you go get, like Jacoby Brissett or something, or if it's a whole new lineup, whoever it is, you need to have an offensive coordinator and a quarterback coach, or an offensive coordinator who operates as a quarterback coach that is developing Kenny Pickett, because that was one major objective that we laid out at the start of the season that was never achieved. And this team deserves a lot of credit for fighting through the end, for finding its feet and getting to the playoffs, and even fighting back in that playoff game. Because I did think there was some resiliency in that game, whereas, against the Chiefs, you didn't really see that much 2 years ago. But there's more needed from this team. You need to develop the quarterback position, whether it is Kenny Pickett, whether it's Mason Rudolph, or whether it's some guy who's not on the team yet. That needs to be a priority. We'll be discussing the offensive coordinator search because I'm not 100% sure. I'm not even 50% sure that they're bringing back Eddie Faulkner and Mike Sullivan as a combination of offensive coordinators, with Faulkner being the OC and Sullivan calling the plays. I do think that they're going to try to revamp things quite a bit here. Now, they might keep like a guy like Faulkner on, because I think he's done a really good job with the running backs and Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. But I also think that they're going to try to get a new face in the offensive coordinator position. And we've talked about a few on this show so far, even before this offseason, talking about, Eric Bieniemy, if he's let go by Washington, Kellen Moore, with Staley being fired from the Los Angeles Chargers, and Brian Schottenheimer, who if Mike McCarthy's out in Dallas, he's another offensive coordinator to be on the board. And there's a lot of other people too. There's quarterback coaches that people are really interested in. And there could be some interesting moves there. But the priority needs to be finding an offensive coordinator, play caller, and a developer of quarterbacks who's used to developing quarterbacks in the NFL, who is in tune with what's going on in the NFL and the trends that are creating better offense and better flowing offenses and better spots for game manager quarterbacks. Because as much as if you believe in Kenny Pickett, I still think that's the kind of quarterback that he's going to be. He's not going to be the guy that's going to be making ridiculous plays left and right. He's going to be a good decision maker, and that's what you need, a coordinator and coach who can facilitate that. So lots of questions going into the offseason. We'll explore more of these on the full episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Hang in there, Steelers fans. We'll be back with a full episode very soon right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.